go to Exodus 22. Exodus 22. We're continuing to look at the law that God gave Moses on Mount Sinai, and we're going to unpack it the rest of the book of Exodus, all the way up to the end, is going to be focused on God's law and then the tabernacle of God and the purpose of the tabernacle, the implements of the tabernacle, the priesthood, and how God establishes all those things. And He's given all this to Moses, and Moses is giving it to his people, and that's what we're going to be looking at. So I want to encourage you. Many people get to this point in the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, and it gets kind of stale to them. I want to encourage you, this is important stuff. I asked an evangelist one time why the Old Testament was important, and he looked at me and he said this. He said, "Son, anything God writes in His Bible is important." I had to think about that one for a little while, and he's right. So even though it may not be New Testament juicy stuff, this is really juicy Old Testament stuff, and it has a very clear purpose and intent. And if you'll hang in there as we move through this, you'll begin to see things differently as we walk through this. So let's do that. Let's look at the law that God has given. Now, in chapter 21, we ended verses 33 to 36, beginning the section on laws about restitution. So we're going to continue walking through that tonight. So let's pick it up in verses 1 through 4. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. And if a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun is risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him, and he shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. And if the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it's an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. So let's go back and unpack this section. In verse 1, outlining theft. So stealing or selling an ox or a sheep that does not belong to you, you have to pay back 4 or 5 times. So you see that there, and it's really interesting, isn't it? If you're a poor guy and you're stealing another guy's sheep, ox, or cattle, and you don't have a lot of money, you might not want to steal because you're going to have to pay it back 4 times over. So notice how God is teaching His people that honesty matters, that integrity counts, and that cheating and stealing is not something that you want to get into. Look at verse 2. If a thief is found breaking in at nighttime, and the homeowner strikes and kills the thief, the homeowner shall not be punished. That's what it means when it says there's no blood guilt for him. But notice this now in verse 3. If it's daytime and the thief breaks in and steals and he's caught, he shall pay for what he is trying to steal. But notice, if he has nothing, then he'll be sold as a slave. So notice again, the intent is not to steal that which does not belong to you. Breaking in today or in the daytime, and look at verse 3. Let's just walk through that carefully. If the sun is risen on him, there shall be no blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he will be sold for his theft. So restitution is key. If he didn't have the money, he would be sold. And the stipulation here is to protect the homeowner as well as the thief. So really cool how God does that with this just law. So let's look at verse 5. If a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed over, he lets his beast loose into his neighbor's field, and it feeds in another man's field, and he shall make restitution from the best of what he has in his field, meaning his crops, and in his vineyard. So if he doesn't pin up his oxen and his ox goes in and grazes. I don't know if you guys know, but ox has a voracious appetite. And those things can eat and eat and eat. So if that were to happen and he didn't take care of his ox, he would not only have to pay for what his ox ate, but he would have to give the best of what he has to replace what his neighbor or his other field owner lost. Look at verse 6. If a fire breaks out and it catches in thorns, in other words, in this day and time, they would burn the thorns and the thickets around the fields. Usually they were in perimeters or around the fields. And farmers would oftentimes burn those thickets. And they would have to stand there like we do to make sure the fire didn't spread out into the area where the crops were. But if they didn't do that and the fire broke out and it burned not only the thorns and the thickets and the weeds and all that stuff, but it also burned the crop, he would have to make full restitution for everything that was destroyed in a fire that he set. So again, notice it's teaching responsibility, it's teaching integrity and accountability. Verses 7 through 9, it looks at trust. I don't know if you guys remember, but when I was a kid, middle school, a man's handshake consummated the deal. Remember that? If a man said, "I'll do it," you could just about go to the bank. It was going to be done. Or he would not give his word that it was going to be done. And if he shook on it, we lived in a rundown house in Dunellen. The cracks in the floors. In the wintertime, Mom would put rugs over the cracks, and we'd watch the rugs move across the floor when the wind blew because the cracks were so wide. And we'd curl up in bed, and my brother would come over and jump in my bed with me because body heat's good. And we'd curl up together, and we'd watch the rugs move across the floor. Well, Mom and Dad finally had enough money together that they bought a double-wide trailer out in about 4 miles outside of town. And Dad and my brother and I were clearing off the lot where we were going to put the trailer, and we were burning it off. And Dad lost track of the time. And we looked at his watch, and he had 5 minutes to get into town because he had to sign the loan papers for the trailer. So we jumped in the truck, back when you could ride in the back of the truck, and my brother and I was back there, and Dad's booking it into town. I mean, he's driving fast. So we get into town to the bank, and the owner or the manager of the bank is closing up, turning out the lights, and Dad walked in. Never will forget this. Dad walked in, and he looked at my dad, and I don't remember his name, but my dad's name was Wilbur, and the branch manager said, "I was wondering if you were going to make it. Here's the paperwork for your trailer." He said, "But you know what? All I need is one thing from you, and we'll do this on Monday." Dad said, "What do you need?" He goes, "I need your word that you're going to pay this loan." And he reached his hand out. And Dad walked up with a tear in his eyes, and he grabbed that man's hand, and they shook hands. He said, "Wilbur, the trailer's yours. Have a good weekend. Come see me next week whenever you have time." Never will forget that. That handshake consummated the deal, and Dad gave that man his word, and I just always remembered that moment. What we're looking at here is trust and a breach of trust. So let's look at the consequences for breaching a trust. Verse 7, if a man gives to his neighbor money or goods, this is oftentimes done when they would travel to see family, and they would take the goods out of their house because they had very little security, and they would put it with their neighbors, so their neighbors would watch over it while they were going their trips to Jerusalem or Bethlehem or wherever they were going. And because when they went, they would be gone for weeks. And so they would do this. So notice, if a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe, and it's stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is found, the thief not only has to pay back what he was trying to steal, but he has to pay back double. Okay, that's pretty stiff. But, verse 8, if the thief is not found, he steals, but he's not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. In other words, what that means is they would go down to the synagogue or to the temple, and they would bow before the altar of God, and they would pray. And God would signify to the priest whether or not the one who was chartered to take care of the owner's goods was guilty. And so they would do that. And the Lord moved and the guy was innocent, God would reveal that. But if the Lord moved and the guy was guilty, then he would have to pay back double for trying to steal his neighbor's goods that his neighbor left him to take care of. So it's a powerful lesson here. Let's look at verse 9. Every breach of trust, whether it's an ox, donkey, sheep, cloak, any kind of lost thing of which one says, this is it, the case of both parties went before the Lord, and the one whom God condemned would pay back double to his neighbor. Okay? So that's what we're getting at here. Again, God is outlining for us what it looked like to have integrity and accountability and trust in society. You know as well as I do, you guys have been living as long as I have. When a society no longer trusts itself, it decays, it declines. Trust is huge in society. And when we don't have trust, everything else unravels. So that's what God is putting forth here. So in verses 10 through 14, God goes through some interactions with neighbors and how to have proper conduct with neighbors. So look at verse 10. If a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep safe, and it dies, or it's injured, or it's lost, it's driven away without anyone seeing it, an oath by the Lord shall be between them both to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. The owner shall keep or shall accept the oath. He shall not make restitution. So, same thing here, whether it's animals or beasts or property of the neighbor, they would go before the Lord, and the Lord would reveal whether the person, the neighbor who was entrusted, was innocent or guilty. And if guilty, he had to make full restitution. Look at the rest of verse 11. The owner shall accept the oath. He shall not make restitution. So if God said that the neighbor who was entrusted to care for the goods or the beast, if God revealed that that neighbor was innocent, then no restitution would have to be paid. Okay, so notice how they depended upon the Lord for the final word when it came to these matters of accountability and trust. Oh, it'd be really cool if we did that in our society today. Verse 12. But if it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to his owner. So, if the neighbor's watching the beast and the beast is then stolen, then he would have to make restitution. And if the beast was stolen and it got away from the person that stole it, and other animals, wolves, lions, whatever other animals, carnivores they have in that part of the world, if it is torn apart and killed by the beast, they would have to bring back the evidence to show that, and then the owner who let it go or the neighbor who let it go would not have to make restitution because the animal lost its life in the wild. Verse 14, if a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it's injured or it dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. If the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution, and if it was hired, it came for its hiring fee. So, in other words, if the owner who was watching it hired some people to watch it, and then it disappeared, the owner who watched it had to pay the hiring fee for the property of the owner who lost it. So it's just giving us laws of restitution. God is trying to provide structure in the human society of Jerusalem or in Israel so that they had law and they had order. Now the rest of the chapter is now focusing on social justice. So let's look at the laws of social justice. The first few verses there in 16 and 17 deal with sexual immorality or the pretense of sexual immorality. If a man seduces a virgin, now remember in antiquity at this time, A virgin was between the age of 13 to 15, possibly 16. She's a young girl. Okay, so if a man seduces a teenager, in essence, who is not betrothed, and he lies with her, sleeps with her, he shall give the bride price. So if daddy said, in order to have my daughter as a dowry price, you have to pay 30 shekels, let's say. And a guy who seduces the guy's daughter and is not his betrothed, he would have to pay the price of the dowry for the man's daughter that he seduced. 17, if her father utterly refuses to give his daughter to this guy, if the guy doesn't have a good reputation, the guy's not honorable, and the father says, no, I'm not giving you my daughter, and you're not taking her hand in marriage, then the guy who seduced his daughter would have to pay whatever the equal bride price was for virgins, and that was set by the priest in the town that they lived in. And so God is outlining that for them. Verse 18, notice the price of sin here. First, witchcraft, sorcery, the black arts. If you were caught doing it, you died. Real short, sweet, brief. Whoever lies with an animal, which was big in this day, whoever lies with an animal gave his life. If caught, gave his life, gave her life. The price was death. Whoever sacrificed, note this now, imagine what would happen in America if this was the law of the land here. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than God alone, you're dead. If caught, you forfeit your life. So notice, God is a jealous God, and He did not want any other gods, any other idols taking His place. Okay, and so He had very strong rules, laws that He expected to be followed. Verses 21 to 27, we move to oppression. So let's look at 21. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. What he's saying here is that it is not permissible for you to treat a foreigner wrongly. Because he's saying, remember, you spent 430 years in Egypt as a sojourner. So it's not permissible for you to be brutal or to maim or to hurt or to kill a foreigner or an alien, a Gentile who's not a Jew in their cultures. God was real clear about their behavior. Verses 22 to 24, he talks about widows. Look at it with me. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will hear, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Again, notice God's stance in the protection and the sanctity of human life. And He outlines that for us very clearly in these laws. Look at verses 25 to 27. Verse 25, he talks about money. And he talks about lending. So if Mark was to lend me money, notice what the law says. If you lend money to any people, any of my people with you, who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest for him. So if I borrowed $1,000 from Mark, and Mark out of his kindness gave me $1,000, I wouldn't have to pay back $1,250. I would only have to pay back what Mark gave me or lended to me. The practice of the day in banks, you know how it works, is still the same in our culture. But here, when lending God's people to God's people, there was no interest charged. Let's look at verse 26. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his holy or his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. And what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. In other words, you see, if you watch any history channels, or if you watch the Jesus of Nazareth or any of the films, you see them dressed in their robes, and then they would have an outer robe over the inner robe. That's the cloak that they're referring to here. They would take that at nighttime and wrap it around themselves, and they had a hood they would put over themselves so that when the temperature dropped 20, 25 degrees at night in the desert air, it would be 110, 120 in the daytime. It might drop to 70 or 80 at night. That's a big swing. And things get cold because you're used to 110, 120 degrees during the day. So they would curl up in their cloaks while they were tending sheep or traveling, and it kept them warm. And God is saying here, do not take that from them. So if He gives you His covering as a pledge for a loan that is given, make sure before the sun goes down, He gets His cloak back so that He can have warmth in the evening when the sun goes down. And then in the final 3 verses there, let's look at verse 28. Notice what he says. Do not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. I want to caution you here to remember this verse. I'll just give you a personal testimony. I didn't vote for Joe Biden. He's not my president. Okay? I didn't vote for him. But notice my obligation as a child of God. When I curse or slander or belittle or malign Joe Biden or anybody in Washington that I did not give my constitutional support to, I am reviling God. What I say about them, I say about God. Be careful. Be careful. And help me to remember to do the same, because sometimes they make really bad decisions. And oftentimes, I don't agree with those decisions. I wouldn't make those decisions. But you have to remember, God in His sovereign wisdom allowed this man to be the leader of the freest country, the biggest country in the world. Therefore, you and I have a Christian responsibility to our God first, and then to the leader who sits in that office second. Just want to encourage you with that truth. Verse 29. Do not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. In other words, give to God what belongs to God. Honor God with the first fruits of all that God's given to you. How far does this extend to? It even extends to your children. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Okay? There's a process there. So my firstborn child was a son. When my son was born, after we got him home, I went outside. We lived in Germany, and Joshua had a ureter problem, and so he was in the hospital for 10 days before we were able to bring him home. When we got home in our upstairs house in Germany, I walked out onto the patio, and I undressed my son, and I held my son up before the stars, and I gave my boy to God. And I prayed over him, and I lifted him up before my Lord. I said, God, this boy's yours. And in your sovereign wisdom, I don't know why you blessed me with a perfectly healthy child. I said, but my boy is yours. Would you give Mary Lou and I the wisdom to raise him in a way that honors you? And I prayed that prayer up until my son became a big person and left the house and is now an adult. God is asking here, demanding here, that the firstborn of every family, the firstborn son of every family, would be given to God. We'll talk more about that as we move through the book of Exodus. 30, you shall do the same with your oxen and your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. If you remember in Israel, what day was it that Mary and Joseph went to the temple to take Jesus before the Lord? Remember what day it was? It was the 8th day. Okay? On the 8th day, they took him to the temple, and he was circumcised, and they prayed over him, and they gave him to the Lord. And that's what this is. This is what drove what Mary and Joseph did in the New Testament, is why they did it, because of this law in the Old Testament given in the book of Exodus. God wanted His people to be holy. He wanted the animals and everything that they had, their crops, their animals, their possessions, everything to be given to Him to honor Him and to thank Him for what He was doing for their lives. So that wraps up that portion. We will continue through with more laws in 23. We'll look at the Sabbath and talk about the Sabbath, and then festivals next week. So let me pray for us, and then I want you to break up into your groups. The questions you have here are really thought-provoking, so I ask you to take your time, because there's a lot to unpack in each of the questions. So let's pray. Father, tonight as we walk through these questions, I pray, God, as our groups assemble, that they would have really good discussion, and I pray You'd guide their time. And I pray, God, that You would just continue to teach us and lead us. In Your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.